You know, it's funny. I was watching this movie, which is way better than I thought it would be. The third act's a little wonky. We'll talk about that. But I was like blown away by some of the stuff in this film. And I was like, where did this director come from? Some of the shots in this movie are just staggeringly creative. My favorite is when the bad guy gets out of his car and goes into the club. When you see it, your jaw will be on the floor. If I were a studio executive, I'd be like, get me this director immediately. So I looked him up, and he directed Hardcore Henry back in 2015. Do you remember that movie? I mean, that was a fun film, and good for Isla Naishuler for sticking it out, because this is 6 years later. And here he is, you know, with, I think, a great calling card movie. And it's also interesting, Hardcore Henry being his last big movie, because Sharlto Copley and Bob Odenkirk have a very similar vibe. That's hilarious. I mean, Sharlto Copley could have starred in this film, quite frankly. But I think Bob Odenkirk is a great choice. Whatever happened to Sharlto Copley? He's got to get on it, because Bob Odenkirk also almost disappeared from Hollywood as well. But Odenkirk took his fate into his own hands. He also got a rather large assist from Vince Gilligan. But Odenkirk didn't just say thank you, he ran with it. And as a result, he's become a really big TV star thanks to Better Call Saul. And now that Odenkirk clearly wants to jump to movies, he's a producer. He's one of the producers on this movie, along with David Leitch, of course, of John Wick fame. Although Leitch did leave John Wick, which is maybe why he doesn't feel bad leeching off of the franchise a little bit. Because that's what everyone said when they saw the trailers for Nobody. They were like, oh, it's a John Wick ripoff. Well, to be fair, first off, seasoned actors starring in action movies has been a thing since Taken, and there have been a lot of them since. And while this movie does have similarities, in some cases very strong similarities to John Wick, and it's written by the same guy who wrote all three of those films, I would say it also is very similar to The Long Kiss Goodnight, with notes of The Accountant and Falling Down. Yeah, it's a pretty good movie if it can be compared to all of those, right? It's missing an element, which I'll tell you at the very end of this review, which would make it perfect. But basically, the idea is that, well, you would expect Keanu Reeves to be as awesome as he is. You wouldn't expect Bob Odenkirk, whose character is holding in a lot of rage, which also makes him very relatable, to be able to deliver these action sequences. But he does. It makes him a little Batman-y in that regard, too, Bob Odenkirk's character. And by the way, speaking of Batman, if you like brooding anti-heroes and dark action movies and shows, then that means that you really love DC. And the best place to find all of that is on HBO Max. Tons of DC movies and some amazing, truly amazing DC TV shows. You need to catch up if you haven't already on Doom Patrol, Titans, Young Justice, and Harley Quinn. All excellent shows with new seasons fast approaching that will be HBO Max exclusives. And so you're going to want to be able to be ready to watch those because they're going to explode in a big way. And of course, there are other great movies and shows on HBO Max too. As I've been telling you, I've rewatched both Friends and Big Bang Theory recently. And also just the other night, I rewatched Training Day, which was so much fun. And I recently also watched one of my favorite classic movies, Great Expectations from David Lean. I love that movie. It's so good. So sign up now with the link down below in the video description to get in on the action. Again, sign up today for tons of DC content and more with the link down below in the video description. So back to Bob Odenkirk, he recently revealed he's been training for this movie since 2017, and it shows. Also, I'm happy to report he's not a Gary Stu, where he differs from Batman, and that he takes a pretty serious beating himself multiple times. Although, like Batman, he survives. And in fact, if you told me that Shane Black, I laughed out loud a couple times during this movie, his character is very cool. But if you told me that Shane Black wrote this film, who wrote The Long Kiss Goodnight and many 90s hits, I would believe it. This film is very 90s. I mean, the suburbs are still the enemy here, as are the Russians, although the Russians are coming back in a major way with villainy these days. And as I said, though, the third act, like a lot of 90s movies, doesn't have the same energy or inventiveness of the first two-thirds. And I think that will help. That will be one of the reasons that keeps Nobody from becoming an instant classic. But the fight sequences, the fun of seeing them done so well by Bob Odenkirk and Naishuler's very clever camera work, which is one of the things that I think that differs Nobody from John Wick, because there, Chad Stahelski's camera is pretty static. So Isla Naishuler just gets right in there. I mean, his camera is like John Wick. It's so great. These are the elements that make the movie stand out and worth seeing. I suspect the movie will do really solid business, and I think a lot of people will be caught off guard by how good it is, and it'll have very good word of mouth. But I think that Odenkirk's lack of mainstream star power, I know a lot of you like Better Call Saul, but it's not a huge hit. So I think not a lot of people will be like, oh, I must see the latest Bob Odenkirk project. I think that, and again, the weak third act, which basically is very Home Alone, it's just, it was not exciting. I was like, oh, you're doing that. I think that will likely keep it from being a breakout hit. And also, I don't want to give anything away, but in the third act, they kind of expand the history of the character a little bit. And I think that the characters that they add aren't as well defined as Bob Odenkirk's. So it just didn't really work out. It just seemed like if they weren't going to flesh it out better, they shouldn't have even bothered to go there. This movie will be a great calling card for every single person involved. When I was watching this movie, I was like, okay, next they talk about maybe going on a trip to Italy, and I was like, there's your sequel. So I would love to see them go on a family trip to Italy. And I think that reminded me of like the National Lampoon's movies. And I think that that's the secret ingredient that this movie is missing in its stew. It needs to add Clark Griswold. And I think then it would just take off like crazy. And that would really differentiate it from John Wick. I think that as the movie progressed, they lost the suburban dad angle a little bit. And because, Clark Griswold gets pretty upset himself sometimes, and that's always very amusing. And so having Bob Odenkirk take that over with an action angle to it, I think would just be fantastic. So Nobody isn't perfect, but it's darn close. And I think that I'm excited for it to have room to improve going forward. So that's my review of Nobody, which I think is definitely worth seeing. Again, this is a Universal movie. So while it's exclusive to theaters this Friday, in just 17 days, it will hit PVOD for a $20 rental. All right, so share your own thoughts down below, subscribe today, and of course, as always, you can check out some more videos right now.